is I look around at people who are, or I would say, are old people. Then I finally realize they're the same age as me. So, I can understand that when we think about getting old. And I have neuropathy in my feet. It's caused me to be a little unbalanced when I walk and, things like that. But there are a lot of things on the plus side for me. If I get dementia, then what would I do? I'd be in big trouble. It's a little harder to breathe these days. Of course, like I said, I'm recovering from pneumonia, and I survived a week in the hospital here, so that'll tell you something right there. Got to be tough. But Don and I have been knowing each other probably over 20 years, and so I know he's got a good sense of humor. So when he was having trouble with the word prosper, I just heard him say what he gave to us. It reminded me of Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Remember that movie? They all get to the radio station, and he said, there's this guy with, it's playing, he said, well, he's our guitar player. It just kind of reminded me of that, which I kind of like that movie. Square it up. Okay, maybe that'll be a little better. So what are we going to talk about today? Profanity. Now look, I grew up in a household that was not a Christian household. My parents didn't really do anything bad or wrong or anything like that. And never saw my dad drunk. He drank a beer once in a while, but never saw him drunk. Not that mitigates what he was, just trying to describe to you what it was like. And so there's profanity. And I tell people, and I'm 67, I said, I know all the bad words, right? And it's hard to keep them under control. And I'll give you an example of this. Is probably about 40 years ago, give or take, I was underneath a car in my in-laws' yard, and we were going to change the steering box out. So it was really hard to get that off that knuckle, and so I'm underneath it there trying to help pry, and her dad is standing in front of the car with about an 8-foot cheater bar, big steel bar. And it slips off, hits me right square between the eyes. I mean, it's like you see stars like Cary Grant, Betty Grable. No, I'm just kidding. I can see stars. And her mom was sitting about 3 feet away. She started laughing. I thought, well, why is this so funny? He said, I'll tell you what, boy. She said, you didn't say a thing. No cuss word or nothing. I said, well, that doesn't mean I didn't think of them. That's for sure. You have to control yourself, and not just with profanity, but we're going to talk about euphemisms as well, and and understanding how do they affect the people around us is really what we're talking about, and how they affect God. And for Ephesians 4:29, the American Standard Version says, "Let no corrupt speech." Well, I tell you, I got scared one time. There's a friend of mine that was in preaching school together, and he happened to be in town. His in-laws lived in the same town that we grew up in. We didn't know them. And we went over there. And of course, I crack jokes about everything. I tell people I'm a counterpuncher. Say something, I'm going to play off of it, springboard off of it or something. And it was interesting that they, just after just 5 minutes, she turned to her husband. She said, I don't like this idle talk. Oops. I said, I'm so sorry. And myself and the other guy, we walked outside. He said, let's go somewhere else. Anything you say, if it's not quoting scripture, is idle talk for her. And I said, man, that's tough. Because there's a lot of things you can say and joke about, things like that are not inappropriate. Now, sometimes I tend to lean toward the inappropriate, that's for sure. And I'm not going to say that I don't. But like I say, it's hard for everybody. Who grew up in that environment, and Carla didn't grow up in that environment. She doesn't cuss. I don't either. Once in a while, something slips, maybe. Yeah, how's it slip? I mean, that's just funny. But I'm saying, there's moments of weakness that I get into as well, but she doesn't. She was a good little girl, and she wasn't allowed to cross the street. Go anywhere. But anyway, she's a wonderful person. So that's where we get this idea of corrupt speech. Corrupt means to kind of destroy something that's good. It means rotten, decayed, worthless, morally bad. And like I say, these are things that we need to be aware of and restrain ourselves. And it's just something we've got to divest ourselves of our former life, if you will. Profanity is classified as abusive, vulgar, irreverent language, irreverence for God. I guarantee you, I do not take the name of the Lord in vain. Just don't do it. Harder for some of the other things, but I just don't do that. That which pollutes our speech. I tell a story about when my first work was in Kansas. I was in the meat department in this little store, and some guy comes up, and he starts, look at the prices on these things. That blankety-blank butcher back there, that just surprised me. He just came right out of his mouth, and he kept talking about this, that, and the other. And he asked me, he said, this was a small town, maybe, 1,000 people. He said, by the way, he said, what, you live here? And I said, yeah, I did. We just moved here just months ago. He said, oh, wow. He said, what do you do for a living? I said, I'm the preacher up here for the Church of Christ on State Street. He says, oh, really? He said, that's interesting. He said, I bet the Lord sent me to meet you here today. I said, with the mouth that you got? I said, I don't think so. He said, oh, yeah, I'm sorry about all that kind of stuff. And then he disappeared. He just didn't want to be around for anything else. Well, I said, yeah, with that mouth he sent you here? I said, I don't think so. So anyway, it can be dirty, filthy, crude, unwholesome. What about cursing? We think of cursing as somebody pronounces a curse on somebody, but sometimes we say things that are in the form of a curse. And, I remember years ago, I heard my brother-in-law say something. He was mad, and he wasn't a Christian, and he didn't care about anything, and he used the D word that ends in N, you, to some guy who was tearing up his yard or something. We would use a euphemism like, dang you. He used the real word. So regardless of whether you use the real word or euphemism, somebody said, well, would you rather me use a euphemism than doing the real word? No. Here's the thing. Don't use anything. Just keep your mouth shut. And like I said, that's hard. You're probably people in this room, that's one of the hardest things they have to do every day is keep their mouth shut. But, we're exposed to profanity in a lot of different ways. And in music, do you listen to music where there's a lot of profanity? I don't like that. Here's the one that'll get me, kicked in the shins. What about the movies you watch? We're desensitized to it, aren't we? Or we'll defend it by saying, well, that's just depicting reality, right? That's what, if this guy, what was it, American Sniper there about Chris Kyle? A lot of profanity in that movie. And here I'm watching it, and I'm thinking, well, I just dismiss it. But it still influences us. And it's sad that it does. There are contraptions, machines, I guess, that, you can buy that will blank out those words. I don't know why I've never bought one. I don't know. Maybe I don't know. Doesn't bother me as much. That would be my rationalization, right? And I'm not saying that's right. That's for sure. You hear people use phrases like, he cusses like a sailor. I've known some sailors that were members of the church. They didn't cuss. But you know what I'm talking about. There are certain professions that kind of, tend to, gender people who are full of abusive or corrupt speech. That's one. We used to talk about, man, you got a mouth like a cab driver, or something similar to that. Cussing like a sailor. I'm trying to think of another one. It just went out of my head. But anyway, there are different ways. And here's one I hear that's really something funny. Pardon my French. Let me tell you, I took 2 years of French in high school, and I never learned any cuss words in French. Or any cuss words that people would classify, because they're not even French, for one. It's not French at all. I can at least recognize that it's not French. People say, well, pardon my French, but it's not. TV, news, in the workplace. Butchers was something else I thought of, the idea of people who seem to be vile. If you're a meat cutter, I'm sorry, but that's my observation, because I've been in meat rooms in grocery stores. This is really bad. Have you ever seen a small child cuss out one of their parents? This wasn't a cuss word, but there was somebody I went to preaching school with, and Carl and I were sitting there, and we were in worship together. He and his wife were behind us, and they had a little girl about 5 years old. He was trying to get her to do something, and she spit in his face. That would kind of lean me toward violence of some sort. You might get a spanking out of this. I'm not going to knock your head off. But, women and children. Not that it's any worse. Sometimes we have levels in our mind or degrees of things, and it just seems like when a small child cusses somebody out, or I've got 3 grandchildren that are like 5, 4, and 2, and one of my grandchild, that was my Don Atkins impersonation. One of my grandchildren goes to a woman who's a member of the church. He's a Christian. He goes to a nice daycare. The other 2 go to a normal daycare. And not only are they the ones that caused me to get COVID that went into pneumonia, love them to death. But anyway, they bring home other stuff, and they're not really, I've never heard them say anything like that, but they'll say words that, are not appropriate to say. You have something back here called buttocks. Cut that word in half and forget the end. That's, you get that word. This is my, whatever. And so that's just kind of like a beginning. It's kind of like an entryway, if you will, into this. We just need to understand what God expects of us, how He expects us to speak. How bad would it be if I stood up and if I said words that were inappropriate? Why is it any more important for me than it is to you? Well, we just figured you're the preacher. You don't do stuff like that. I have done things like that. I've repented of those things that I have done like that. We all tend to kind of go off and do what we want to do, what we need to do, Richard. We need to do what God wants us to do, that's for sure. So you might ask us, are there any circumstances where profanity is excused? What about you come home and there's ambulances and fire trucks and stuff, and it's on fire, and here's your little 2-year-old or 7-year-old or whatever, they're laying out there and they're burned to death. That'd be horrible. I can't imagine that. Are there any circumstances, like maybe when you're in pain, you ever hit the wrong nail, the fingernail, rather than the regular nail? What about arguing with somebody else? It'd be okay just to cuss them out or use profanity when you're talking with them? Or if you just get angry, your kid did something that was horrible, and what's your first idea? Well, I got to take care of this business. But in anger, you say things that you wouldn't ordinarily say. That's a problem, isn't it? Are there any circumstances of profanity? What about expressing your feelings? You can express your feelings just as well without using profanity. That's just so. Is there any circumstance where profanity is excused? My answer is a big no. Never, never, ever. It's wrong in all places and at all times. Like I say, we're going to get to euphemisms here in a minute. But what does the Bible say about us? We talk about Exodus 20 verses, and not taking the Lord your God in vain, not doing that. God is special to us. He is the deity that created the universe. We need to recognize that in verse 36 again. But I say to you, every idle word men may speak, they'll give an account of it. Well, I don't know if that won't shut your mouth up. I don't know what will. Everything we say In the book of Revelation, it talks figuratively about the book of life. The books were open, and there's the book of life. The only one that can open it is the Lamb of God. There's no real books, but there is remembrance. God isn't taking account of what we do, how we live. God knows that. By your word you'll be justified, and by your word you'll be condemned. That's good to know, right? Because God's going to take that into account. But again, let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth. Those things that are rotten. And then James 3:2, it says, for we all stumble in many things, just like I did just a second ago. If anyone does not stumble in word, he's a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body. It's like a horse has a bridle in the mouth. You need to just allow the bridle to be there and work with it rather than fight against it. That's what we tend to do, is we fight against it. Above all, brethren, do not swear, either by heaven or earth. That's not talking about cursing, but you get the idea of what swearing is. It's a vow that we make to God. So, again, are there any circumstances where profanity is excused? No, never. It's wrong in all places, at all times. This TV Guardian thing, and there's like, I forget what's called, VidAngel or something. It filters out the garbage and trash, out of your, and there's probably other, but this is a somewhat older picture. Maybe something that are better than that. So what about euphemisms? What about slang words? Bywords or forms of swearing, interjection, words thrown in that you sometimes have to think about the meaning of it, or euphemism. And euphemism is a substitute, for actual thing. We say dad burned, darn, dang it, egad, probably not anymore, G or gee whiz. Along with that, I heard something, cheese whiz. I like cheese whiz. Haven't had any for a long time. GOL, gold darn, golly, gosh, heck, geez, jeepers. I knew one lady one time, she's a nurse. She used that phrase, Judas Priest, all the time. Well, of course, that we get that from a biblical aspect, but I've never known the reason for putting those two together. For goodness sake, goodness, thank goodness, my good. And sometimes we'll say like sugar, will mean something else. Oh, sugar. That's a euphemism, for something else. For heaven's sake. For Pete's sake. What does Pete say, man? Well, people think about the Apostle Peter, being the guardian at the gate, right? For Pete's sake. Lordy. Lord have mercy. I used to sing a song a lot. It was an old, I can see the guy. His name. Almost. He was a country singer, Mac Davis. He would sing, "Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble." And I would sing that, when you're perfect in every way. I can't wait to look in the mirror, 'cause I get better looking each day. That's just a bunch of baloney. There you go. Lord have mercy. Good gracious, good grief. What the deuce? We'll go into that one. Oh my God, cheese and rice. All of these things, there's a picture comes into your mind, isn't there? Something you get with that word, something you get with that phrase that you understand what it means. But these are all things that we should, just eliminate, from our vocabulary. Why use these? Because you can't express your feelings any other way? Start reading a book, and then read another book, because that'll help you to increase your vocabulary. So these are slang or euphemisms, whatever you want to call it, but look in the dictionary for some of these, because they're in there. Now, Matthew 5 talks about why swear words or slang words are wrong. You shall not swear falsely, but shall perform your oaths to the Lord. Men in that time, people in that time actually, they would swear, I'll swear by the temple. I'll swear on my mother's grave. You say things like that. Why even say that? Why can't what you say, your word is your bond? You mean what you say. And then he keeps talking about don't swear. He says, and don't swear at all. Either by heaven, for it's God's throne. Now people say, by the throne of God, I swear that that's the truth. Nor by earth, for it's his footstool. Nor by Jerusalem, for it is the great city of the great king, nor shall you swear by your head, because you cannot make one hair white or black. But let your yes be yes and your no, no. I've said that to an elder before because he said one thing and did another. And I said, yeah, and Jesus said, let your yeas be yea and your nays be nay. So these are things that we do to benefit the evil one, if you understand that. We sometimes say, God forbid. That's the proper use of the name for God. God forbid that I should go over here and do this and that. James talks about that. Acts chapter 18, verse 21. If God will. That's a good use of the word God. If the Lord grants or gives me mercy to do that. So what's wrong with profanity? It's a sin against God. We have regular words, and we know what we should say. When we say those things, we need to be careful about what we are saying, what we're talking about, the words that we use, and know and understand the ramifications of it. It can make one unfit for worship. When we worship God, we should come to God with a clean heart. We should come to God and know and understand that He can search our hearts and know what our reason for being here is. It also sets a bad example. You know, you get see if that guy who came into the meat department, if he hadn't said anything like that, I wouldn't have thought anything of him being somebody foul. But his mouth betrayed him, didn't it? Your mouth will betray what your heart thinks as well. You know, these are things we should break from because they're bad habits. Put all filthy communication out of your mouth. Filthy communication, shameful speech, foul talk, unclean talk, vile language. Here's what George Washington said: swearing is a vice so mean and low that every man of sense and character detests and despises it. You ever see a historically accurate, movie, and what it does, people talk, the way they talk, it's different than the way we talk. And they talk with civility, and they talk with respect. And that's the way a lot of people did in predominantly up to the 18th century. They were all civil with one another. And you would see people, there's one movie I really like. It's called Pride and Prejudice. It's from a Jane Austen book. Keira Knightley's the main character in it. And when they would meet somebody, they would curtsy or bow. And that showed respect for the other person, and that's, we don't do that now because it's not part of our culture or anything like that. But George Washington says, that's part of civility, that we retain our good speech. Yeah, there's a plague of profanity. And how can we control it? Out of the abundance of the heart, mouth speaks. Good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good things, and an evil man out of his evil treasure brings forth evil things. Control your heart. And also, control your mouth, control your brain, and we'll show others that we have civility in our minds. It's important because it's kind of like, something that may eat us, or bother us. And, when you use that type of speech, you're talking to somebody, they remember it. They remember what you said. And then they'll say, where were we at? Okay, we were at a funeral home, and I was sitting there, and here's my aunt that just died. Here's my aunt that just died, and this guy's over here cussing like a sailor, a butcher, a taxi driver, whatever like that. That's there's no place for it, and certainly not in reverential, if that's a word, areas. You wouldn't be standing here in the building here doing this, would you? If you go out in the parking lot and get in your car and it doesn't start, then you might say something. We just have to be monitoring what we do and what we say, because we can control that. We can control that. We're in full control of our lives. Whether you're a Christian or not, that's important. And you have control over that, whether you want to decide to obey the gospel. And it's going to be available to you today. I remember giving an invitation one time, and a man came forward. He didn't realize there was a baptistry back there. He'd been going there 6 months. Did not know that there was a baptistry. Well, he found out. Because he was wanting to be baptized. His wife was a member, and he wasn't. And he was a guy that would use profanity from time to time till I dunked him, till he obeyed the gospel, till he was cleansed from his sin. That's what baptism does. It washes away sin. A lot of people think it does other things, but that's primarily what it's there for, to wash away sin. You can become clean and new and have a fresh start. If we can help you in any way, won't you come? All together we stand and sing.